Thank you, Dr. Karat. Yeah, very much in depth. Thank you all. Thank you for being here on this dreary Sunday. And I understand there's also some game or something this evening. I don't know much about that. A little bit of housekeeping, first of all. Right at this very moment at the Indian Mound Museum, one of my Civil War Trail volunteers, Greg Gresham, is giving a talk on Hood's crossing of the Tennessee in October, November 1864. Greg is the expert on Hood's campaign here in Lauderdale County. And I really must offer my sincere thanks to B.C. Clemens as well for being here and there, filming these presentations for his YouTube channel, North Alabama Local History. And I would really recommend, if you haven't gone and looked him up before, to go and find his channel, because he's very dedicated in recording these local history presentations. So first of all, we're going to set a little context in what we're talking about, which is admittedly a very broad topic, which is the Civil War in the Shoals and the Tennessee Valley. When I say the Shoals and the Tennessee Valley, the focus of my research is rather hierarchical. So I focus in, first of all, what happened here in Lauderdale County, and then to a lesser extent what happened in the Muscle Shoals region, and then sometimes I broaden my scope to what happened in the Tennessee Valley. Because in order to understand what happened here, sometimes we have to understand what happened a little further afield that then directly impacted what happened here. The quotation that I've chosen for this title slide comes from the Alabama Secession Convention. This is a quote from Mr. James Clark, the delegate from Lawrence County. The full quotation says, "Shall we ever live to behold the day when Alabama, having assumed the untried responsibilities of separate secession, shall find herself torn, convulsed, and rent in twain by the dissensions of her own people? Shall the very Eden of peace become the home of strife, of carnage, and of destruction?" I chose this quote because I feel, number one, that it's very emblematic of what ultimately did take place here in the Tennessee Valley, the home of strife, carnage, and destruction. And I include it, secondly, because Mr. Clark here, even at the early stage of the moment of the secession of Alabama, is able to clearly see the writing on the wall, that they are on the precipice of what a complete disruption of civil society and the violence that was going to ensue, even at a time when it was not exactly very easy to do that. Now, every time I have spoken to this group, I've told you the story of my fourth great-grandmother, Bethany Gray, and I'm going to do it again. In the very briefest version that I can, Bethany Gray, my fourth great-grandmother, her husband John died on the 27th of October, 1864, leaving her the widowed mother of 10 children. And 4 days later, General Hood began to cross the Tennessee River at Florence with 30,000 Confederates and began skirmishing with Generals Croxton and Hatch along the line of Shoal Creek. And at this time, that Union cavalry had to feed upon the local population, and they came to the home of the newly widowed Miss Bethany Gray. They took the corn from the cribs, they picked it from the fields, they took the bacon from her smokehouse, they shot and killed the pigs from the field, they even took the cooking utensils from her kitchen. And as I started getting into genealogy after high school, after college, I very quickly came upon her story, and I was fascinated. I grew up on the same piece of land where she and her family lived, and I never heard this story. And I wanted to know why. Why was the Union cavalry in Lauderdale County at all in 1864? What were they doing there? What were the events that she and her community went through during the Civil War? And so I was bitten by the bug, and that was about 6 years ago, and I've gone systematically, chronologically through the events of the war since then. And what I have chosen as the bulk of my source material are contemporary 19th century resources. I am not so much interested in what people in the 20th and 21st century wrote about the war. I want to hear it from the people themselves who saw it. So I use mostly the official records of the War of the Rebellion, which is a mind-blowingly expansive set of documents, all of the correspondence and reports from both armies during the war. Sometimes I use diaries that were kept, memoirs that people kept after the war, and then also newspaper accounts as well. I am not going to go through this right now for the sake of time, but this is our roadmap. Essentially, I am going to present a fluid narrative of the chronological events of the war here in Florence and the Shoals, beginning first with the election of 1860 and the secession crisis, and then finally culminating with the restoration of civil government in the summer and fall of 1865. And I will say, any single one of these moments in time could very easily be a presentation in and of itself. So I'm going to do my very best to keep this at an hour or less, because we could really dive further in depth on any one of these. This is a map that I have put together that I drew of the geographical context of the Shoals and the Florence and the Shoals, Muscle Shoals area. In order to understand what happened here, we need to understand why it happened at all. And grounding the Muscle Shoals in its proper geographical context is an essential component of that. The first thing that I will point out is that Florence then, as today, occupies a rather central position between three key points. The first being Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, Memphis, the strategic river port, and Chattanooga, which was not only a river port but also a railroad junction. The fact that Florence finds itself and Muscle Shoals finds itself geographically between these is very significant. And secondly, the railroad network that existed, if I can get my hand to stop twitching, I'll show you. This is the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, which was arguably the most significant east-west railroad in the Confederacy. It connected Memphis and the Mississippi River with the Atlantic Coast Railroad network. And it was the only one in the Confederacy that did so. And it goes right through Tuscumbia, and there was a branch line that came over to Florence. And then third, the Tennessee River, in its peculiar geography, was particularly disadvantageous to the Confederacy in the fact that it flows out of Alabama and north into Tennessee and meets the Ohio River at Paducah, Kentucky, which means that from a very early point in the war, the river was vulnerable to Union incursions by gunboat and then later troop movements from the states of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, like Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota. They are some of the earliest forces that come in. And it's important to know rivers and railroads in the 19th century are by far the most efficient means to move large quantities of goods, material, and men and animals. Roads are nothing like what we would experience today. If you have some dirt road out in the country or some driveway, you know how it becomes impossible to walk through it after it's rained. It's a quagmire. So the nexus here of the railroad and the proximity of the railroad to the river means that the Shoals of the Tennessee River very early on in the war is strategically significant to both sides. So that's the geographical context. This is the political context. In order to understand what happened in the war, we have to understand why the war happened. And there are decades worth of political developments that lead up to the election of 1860, such as the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid. All of these are significant. But the election of 1860 is like the fuse. It's like the match that ignites the fuse of secession. And the fuse of secession explodes the powder keg of civil war. So this is where our story begins, for all intents and purposes, today. Now, the election of 1860 was a four-way race. The Democratic Party had split over the issue of slavery. The Northern Democrats, led by this guy here, Stephen Douglas, essentially believed in the philosophy of what is known as popular sovereignty. So they thought if a territory or a state wants slavery, then they should be allowed to have a referendum and have slavery. Or if, on the other hand, they don't want slavery, they could have a referendum and forbid slavery. Just leave it up to the states. For the Southern Democrats, led by John C. Breckinridge, this was just simply unacceptable. They could not concede of any political philosophy that left open the possibility of the exclusion of slavery from any territory. And they wanted, in fact, an explicit constitutional amendment that would enshrine the right to slave holding. And Lincoln, of course, the Republican candidate, Republicans wanted to prevent the spread of slavery into new states and territories, period. No popular votes, no constitutional amendments. Now, they didn't necessarily want to remove slavery from a state like Alabama or Mississippi where it already existed lawfully, but it was quite another matter to allow it into the new states of the West that were constantly being added into the Union at this time. And interestingly, you could not actually vote for Mr. Lincoln here in Lauderdale County. He wasn't on the ballot. Your choice was between Douglas, Breckinridge, and this man here, John Bell of Tennessee. Bell was a member of the Constitutional Union Party, which was cobbled together basically to act as a compromise candidate because people were seeing the writing on the wall that a split in the Democratic Party would likely ensure the success of the Republicans in the election, and in fact, that is exactly what happened. Now, even before the election, the mechanisms of secession had been put into place. In 1860, the Alabama legislature actually passed an act, the preamble of which goes as follows: whereas anti-slavery agitation persistently continued in the non-slaveholding states of this union for more than a third of a century, evincing a deadly hostility to the rights and institutions of the Southern people. And it goes on to say that if a Republican gains the presidency, that the state of Alabama will have a convention in order to determine and do what they ought to do to protect the right of slaveholding against this so-called anti-slavery agitation. And they allege a subversion of the Constitution. So they've already put into place this mechanism that if a Republican gains the White House, Alabama is going to have a secession convention. Now, Lauderdale County and all the other counties of Alabama, after the election of 1860, elected delegates to this convention. Our delegates were Sidney Cherry Posey and Henry Cox Jones. These men in the 1870s are referred to as the Union candidates. Now, that's a little bit of an overstatement. What the Alabama Secession Convention called the two factions were immediate secessionists and cooperationists. Cherry Posey and Cox Jones were cooperationists. What this means, they wanted Alabama to secede if and only if all of the states of the South went all at once together. And that would be contingent upon yet another convention to be held in Nashville. And then they might send a list of grievances to Congress. And then if Congress doesn't act on them, well, then maybe we'll secede. It was a stalling tactic. The immediate secessionists, however, believed that Alabama could secede at any moment, reclaiming her sovereignty, in essence. And these two parties were not so disparately split. It was a very close split. Immediate secessionists make up about 60% of the delegation, and cooperationists are more about 40% of the delegation, and you can see that by the different votes on the acts of the convention. The cooperationists attempted to put a bill into the Act of Secession that it could only be ratified by popular vote, which was crushed by the immediate secessionists. So the Act of the Convention was the law. It was never passed into popular vote. There was a lot of hesitation, especially among the people in North Alabama, to support immediate state secession. And the reason for this, very plainly, is that we border Tennessee to the north. And if Alabama became its own state and withdrew from the Union, then suddenly Tennessee becomes a foreign nation. And the Tennessee River flowing out of Tennessee and back into Tennessee as an avenue of commerce, it didn't make sense to be a completely separate nation. And in fact, many political leaders in North Alabama were in talks with those in East Tennessee about seceding from Alabama and creating a new state called Nickajack. Now, this never actually materialized, but I think as well, the quote we saw at the beginning shows this, that leaders in North Alabama saw the writing on the wall, that if Alabama secedes and civil war is the result, that North Alabama is going to be on the front lines of earliest occupation. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. And in fact, some of the delegates are really very bold in their condemnation of the Secession Act. The delegate from Madison County, Mr. Clemens, said, "I believe your ordinance is wrong. If I could defeat it, I would, but I know I cannot. The act you are about to commit is to my apprehension treason." Now, this is what was openly said by the delegate from Madison County at the convention. But of course, it really didn't matter. It was a fait accompli. The state of Alabama and the political leaders down to the south, who had the majority, had already decided before the convention even happened that secession was a done deal. And they had sent out emissaries to the other states of the south to try and convince them to leave the Union at the same time. This is a map that I created several years ago that shows the percent of the population which was enslaved in Alabama in 1860 per the census data. You can see here what is today known as the Black Belt region, these counties where, for example, in Marengo County, 78% of the population is enslaved. That's almost 80%, almost 8 out of 10 of the residents of that county are enslaved by one of the other two. The least of all, Winston County had just over 3% of its population enslaved. Now this, of course, is a mountainous, hilly country which did not support large-scale plantation agriculture. And so it's important for us to realize this demographic paradigm that down to the south you have political leaders who are outnumbered 8-1 in their own communities by enslaved populations. And so whenever we're thinking about why Alabama will secede to protect the institution of African slavery, it's important to note the demographics here. And for example, why there was such hesitation on part of counties in the north of Alabama to secede and put their lives and livelihoods on the line to protect that institution.
This is Morris Lentz, and you're watching North Alabama Local History.
Now, even before the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the state of Alabama began mustering regiments of volunteers and militiamen. This man here, Sterling Alexander Martin Wood, the one-time editor of the Florence Gazette, became the commander of the Florence Guards. Their earliest destination was the Gulf Coast, where Alabama and other states of the South had seized federal fortresses that were in their borders. And this is in fact what leads to the opening shots of the Civil War at Charleston, South Carolina, when Confederate forces under Beauregard attempted to take Fort Sumter, and the resistance led to the bombardment of the fort. And whenever the city of Florence receives news of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, it's apparent from the newspaper that the town had a big party. People came out into the streets. There were bands and speeches, fireworks and bonfires, glorious demonstration, enthusiasm unequaled, bonfires in the streets. So this is really the summer of 1861, I consider to be the zenith of Confederate optimism. And as we'll see in a moment, that optimism was very well justified. They had good reason to believe in the eventual success of their cause. Troops began to mobilize through East Tennessee into Virginia. After Virginia seceded following the fall of Fort Sumter, the Confederate capital moved from Montgomery to Richmond, and it was clear that that was going to be the earliest theater of the war, where we see the Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. Bull Run is a complete, thorough federal rout. They were tripping over themselves trying to get back to Washington, D.C. In fact, senators and congressmen had ridden out in carriages to get a glimpse of the real-life battle. They have picnic baskets with champagne and oysters and opera glasses to watch the battle. And whenever it was clear that the Federal Army was getting beaten, they hightailed it back to Washington and were trampling over retreating soldiers in the roads leading back to the Capitol. And this essentially knocks the Federal Army out of the war for the rest of 1861 in the East. And it ramps up fervor for the Confederacy to a fever pitch. J.P. Cannon, the diarist from Gravelly Springs, talks about receiving letters from the home front at this time. The old men sat at the post office reading the letters from the soldiers at home. And he says that the conversation went like this: "Didn't I tell you one Southerner could whip 5 Yankees? Boys, you better hurry up and get there before the next battle if you want to share in the glory, for we'll clean 'em up next time for sure." This perception, this misperception, this naive, juvenile perception of war as some kind of glorious adventure, that you're going to miss out on your share of the glory if you don't get there quick, is really very shocking to consider how short-sighted and naive people were at this time in the summer of 1861. Now, developments very quickly heat up, and the Tennessee Valley realizes that it's going to very quickly be under the gun. The Confederates took the city of Columbus, Kentucky, violating the state's ostensible neutrality. Columbus is where the Mobile and Ohio Railroad met the Ohio River, so it was a significant point for that reason. And in response, Ulysses S. Grant, future president and victor of Appomattox, who is this time only a brigadier general recently promoted, takes the city of Paducah, Kentucky, which is where the Tennessee River meets the Ohio. And suddenly, political leaders in North Alabama realized that the Tennessee River is vulnerable to federal incursions, and with it, the Memphis and Charleston Railroad near its banks. Brigadier General Walker here described the Memphis and Charleston as the vertebrae of the Confederacy. It's the backbone of the Confederacy, and protecting it at all costs was of vital importance to the Confederacy at this point in time. And leaders in North Alabama sent out a circular letter in the fall of 1861 calling for recruits, and J.P. Cannon actually joins what would become the 27th Alabama Infantry Regiment at this point in time. His father, before this, had refused to allow him to go because he was only like 14 or 15. But finally, when Grant takes Paducah and everyone realizes that the Tennessee Valley is probably about to be invaded, his father concedes and allows him to enlist. The linchpin, the point that was of such critical importance is a place called Fort Henry, which is located the land between the lakes up in Kentucky, where the Tennessee River flows into Kentucky and creates a little boot hill in the north part of Tennessee. Fort Henry and Fort Hyman, which was directly across, enslaved Africans from North Alabama were sent downriver to labor on this fortification to shore it up, because Fort Henry was situated on an absolutely terrible location, strategically. It was on a slough of the river, on a floodplain, and by New Year's 1861-62, the fort was flooded, and Confederate leaders realized that it was an untenable position. So they were racing against the clock to build a new fortress called Fort Hyman on the high ground across the river. Their defensive line stretched from the Mississippi River through Forts Henry and Donelson on the Cumberland River, all the way to Cumberland Gap, virtually the entire northern border of the state of Tennessee. And here's a quote from J.P. Cannon in his memoir. In the fall of 1861, it was generally believed that the Federals were planning an invasion by way of the Tennessee. The war was coming to our very doors. And indeed it was. On February 6th, 1862, a Federal gunboat flotilla led by Admiral Foote went to Fort Henry, bombarded the fortress for 75 minutes, and the flag inside the fort was hauled down. At that point, the fort was already virtually abandoned anyway. They had moved most of the troops 13 miles over to the Cumberland River to protect Fort Donelson, which guarded the approaches to Nashville, which was an infinitely more strategically important location. So they had basically given up on Fort Henry anyway. What's significant for Florence and the Shoals about the fall of Fort Henry is, number one, that the Tennessee River is suddenly thrown open to incursion by federal naval forces. And there is a gunboat expedition led by Lieutenant Commander Phelps. 3 gunboats, the Lexington, Tyler, and the Conestoga, are dispatched downriver to disable a railroad bridge near Paris, Tennessee. Whenever they get to the railroad bridge, they find that a Confederate flotilla has disabled the bridge to prevent them from going any further up the river, and they're making a hasty getaway. So Phelps and his men repair the bridge and give chase. They chase the Confederates all the way down through Hardin County, Tennessee, and into North Alabama. They come to Florence on the morning of February 8th, 1862, and see that the Confederates have scuttled some transport steamers at the Florence wharf. And they come ashore, they try and salvage as much war material as they can, and a delegation of citizens from Florence meets with Phelps and his men. And they have 2 requests. The first is that they might be able to quiet the fears of their wives and daughters that they should not be molested. And secondly, that Phelps please not destroy the railroad bridge. Those were the 2 things. And in response, Phelps told the citizens that they were neither ruffians nor savages and were there to enforce the law and protect them from violence. And that the bridge held no significance to him as far as he could see, so he spared the bridge. But Phelps, in his official report, is just over the moon reporting on what he calls gratifying proofs of loyalty from the local citizens living along the river, that they hailed the stars and stripes, that old men had tears in their eyes as they hailed their national flag and expressed a sense of optimism for the prevailing of the Union. Now, shortly thereafter, on February 16th, just a matter of a week or so after the fall of Fort Henry, Fort Donelson is captured on the Cumberland, and 30,000 Confederates are surrendered and become prisoners of war. They end up in places like Camp Morton in Indianapolis, where my fifth great-grandfather will die. He was in the Tennessee Regiment. He was an old man by that time, and these guys are out in the snow, in the trenches, trying to guard the fort. And by the time they get to these prison camps, a lot of them have camp diseases, pneumonia, things like that. So the mortality rate would have been terrible. And with the capture of Fort Donelson, holding on to Nashville for the Confederates becomes essentially moot. They can't hope to keep the city of Nashville if Donelson on the Cumberland is occupied by the Federal Army. So Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederate commander, abandons Nashville and shifts his focus to the south, to the defense of Corinth, Mississippi, which is a strategic railroad junction. It's where the Memphis and Charleston Railroad met the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. So this is the nexus of transportation between the Mississippi and the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico and the Ohio River. It's an extraordinarily significant point. And as Johnston and the Confederates are trying to protect Corinth, Ulysses S. Grant and the Federals set their sights on taking Corinth. And they start piling men and resources near Savannah, Tennessee, because now, of course, the Federal Army has control of the Tennessee River. And they start setting up headquarters at Pittsburgh Landing in preparation for a campaign to take the city of Corinth. Now, before an all-out assault was planned, guys like William Tecumseh Sherman are leading these surreptitious fly-by-night raids to try and cut the railroad bridge over Bear Creek in present-day Colbert County. But for a variety of reasons, they're unsuccessful. And Grant becomes convinced that they're going to have to move the whole army and besiege the city of Corinth. And he's waiting for Don Carlos Buell, leading the Army of the Ohio, to join him at Pittsburgh Landing so that they can make a joint press upon Corinth. And Buell is a snail. He is taking his time, his poor sweet time. He takes weeks to bridge the Duck River at Columbia, trying to make it overland to Savannah, and Grant is begging him to get there so they can make their campaign. Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederate commander, has absolutely no intention of sitting around while Buell takes his time joining Grant and decides to strike first. So Johnston and his Confederates surprise the Federal encampment near Shiloh Church on the morning of April 6th, 1862. And what happens is the two-day Battle of Shiloh. Now, Shiloh, it is difficult to overstate just what a mind-blowing event this would have been in 19th century terms. I've heard it said before in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary that more Americans were killed in Shiloh than in all previous American wars combined. That's not exactly true. By the numbers that I find, it is true that more Americans were killed at Shiloh than in the War of 1812 and in the Mexican-American War combined. But now we're talking about 48 hours worth of battle. These were wars that took years between them to take place. More Americans killed in 2 days than in 2 entire wars. The carnage would have been unfathomable to a 19th century audience. And indeed, it's really going to wake people up to the reality that this isn't some glorious adventure on foreign fields of battle, but this is going to be a tooth and nail slaughter. And guys like William Tecumseh Sherman, Ulysses S. Grant, are going to cut their teeth on the war and the reality of what this war is on the banks of the Tennessee River at Shiloh. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Shiloh, Brigadier General Ormsby McKnight Mitchell here moves overland and basically walks into Huntsville. He meets no resistance. This was on April 11th, so only 4 days after the Battle of Shiloh. Mitchell and the Army of the Ohio take the city of Huntsville, which is also a railroad hub at that time, and they begin spreading out and occupying virtually all of North Alabama along the Tennessee River. Now, they don't really have the men to occupy every square foot of land in North Alabama, and they meet with instant, what we might call now insurgency, where rebel guerrilla bands are burning railroad trestles and cutting telegraph wires and just making life difficult for the Federal Army in North Alabama. Now, at the end of May 1862, the Federals actually do take Corinth. It is abandoned by the Confederate Army. The Confederates move south toward Tupelo, and the Union Army sets its sights on its next target. Grant, with the Army of the Tennessee, is eventually going to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. That's his next target. And Buell here is ordered to take Chattanooga, which is a critical railroad junction. And so he starts to move east in the summer of 1862, and he moves through Florence and the Shoals. As I said, Buell is a snail. He takes his dear sweet time. Actually, in June 1862, whenever the Army of the Ohio crosses the Tennessee River at Florence, they took apart the joists and rafters of the storehouses in Florence to build a steam ferry, because by that point the Confederates had scuttled the railroad bridge. But they actually literally took apart the storehouses to build a bridge for themselves. It was also at this time that a gentleman named Samuel Stafford, who owned a dry goods store here in Florence, had barrels of whiskey, French brandy, peach cordial confiscated for medical use of the Army of the Ohio. He went to headquarters to get a voucher for his property, and they told him, well, you know, the guy who's supposed to give vouchers is on the other side of the river. He hasn't crossed yet. So Mr. Stafford waits for a number of hours, and it's nightfall, and they say, well, you know, you better come back tomorrow. He still hasn't shown up. And so the new day dawns, and the Army of the Ohio actually starts rolling out of town. And Mr. Stafford is standing on the street corner, and he watches wagons roll by that are laden with the barrels of whiskey from his store.